Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we have Annette Altmans. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
And for those of you out there who do not know who Annette Altmans is an abuse survivor and the founder of the MEND Project with a D, a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization. And the MEND Project is here to help educate survivors and responders. They have courses, they have free webinars, and a very comprehensive website with free downloadable tools to better understand what is happening to you. Plus, they have blogs that I have actually linked to before as a resource in our newsletter. So, Annette Altmans, thank you for being here with us today. I know a big focus for you and the MEND Project is on hidden forms of emotional abuse. So, why is that a focus for you?
Oh, that's a great question. Basically, because statistics show that 50% of adults have experienced some form of emotional aggression, and 50% of adults have experienced coercive control. But 100% of people who have experienced any kind of relational abuse are experiencing what we call covert emotional abuse or hidden forms of abuse, those more subtle, hard to identify types of abuse. And they don't know that it's abuse that they're experiencing. So they don't reach out to a domestic violence agency for support or education. They tend to go to people like a therapist or their pastor or friends. And sadly, but what is often the case is that most therapists have had very little training on domestic violence. You would think that they would be mandated to have that type of training, but they aren't. And pastors are expected, or faith leaders of any kind are expected to be experts on a multitude of topics, but they don't understand the true core, the root of domestic violence, which is covert emotional abuse. That's the thing that keeps them confused and trapped, and where they have, what I like to call hopium, where they believe things are going to change because they received an apology, but the apology didn't translate into anything tangible. And so it's this whole dynamic that is underrepresented. I was unable to find resources when I went through this. And so it just became a passion of mine to dissect what this is and provide as much comprehensive material as I could so that people could find answers quickly and stop that chronic state of high stress and confusion, or what are known as trauma states. And I've listened to your podcast so many times and have heard, and this is my personal experience too, after interviewing hundreds of survivors, is that sometimes they're stuck in these states of confusion, not just for months or years, but sometimes decades, not understanding what the core reason of the relationship problem stem from. So that's the why and the trauma it causes, because most of these survivors develop PTSD or complex PTSD, which then compromises their cognitive abilities, which makes it even more difficult to understand what's happening to them. So that's the why. And I want to also say that there's a lot of stories in the headlines that have come up over the years, like the Dr. Larry Nassar case with USA Gymnastics, and all these precious survivors who went through not only the original abuse from him, but the double abuse from the FBI, USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University. But that was covert emotional abuse that groomed them and confused them into believing that that was a bona fide medical procedure or treatment. And the same thing with Harvey Weinstein. They're lured into these situations using a lot of disguised manipulation and even the support of his staff. So it's this confusion where they're just blindsided, but it's that covert language and that gamesmanship that hooks them into these situations.
And can you share a little bit more about covert emotional abuse and what that actually looks like?
Sure. Covert emotional abuse would just be those hidden manipulative tactics that are hard to identify. So, first off, the survivor doesn't identify what's happening. That makes it hard to describe and almost impossible for them to then confront it. So, the survivor raises a reasonable complaint, concern, or maybe it's a hurt. And a healthy person would say, well, tell me more. I want to understand why you're feeling that way. They come at it with a sense of curiosity. That's what a healthy person does. But an abuser will immediately oppose them. What we have is about 34 identified behaviors that we have on our website. It's in our terms and definitions tool. And so I'll just read off a few of them for you. Minimization, where they downgrade what the victim values and make it less important. They may even shame them for having a certain belief or value. Blame shifting, where you raise a concern, but suddenly the whole conversation is flipped around on you and the survivor is defending themselves. Deflection, changing the topic. So you'll have this hour and a half circular conversation that goes nowhere, and you never address the original concern in the first place. False accusations are very common, where they'll take a shred of truth and distort it with a false accusation. So suddenly the victim is really confused because there's partial truth there, but now they're on the hot seat and they're defending themselves, and the original topic is still not being discussed. Catastrophizing, where they will take something and blow it out of proportion so that now they're having such a big reaction to some small little thing that the survivor is wondering what they said wrong and how they can calm down their escalation. It can talk reason into them. And so there again, they're on the defensive. We all know about rationalizing, justifying, entitlement, where they genuinely have a belief that the one who causes harm has a genuine belief that they're entitled to preferential treatment in the relationship, where they're entitled to dominate the relationship. And so there's so many of these behaviors, but the mechanics of what's really happening is that they are viewing this concern, they're offended by it. They view it as an argument to win, not something where the survivor wants to deepen their emotional connection. They want to be understood. They want to experience empathy if they were slighted or disappointed or hurt in some way. They want it to deepen their understanding of each other, which is a healthy, reasonable ideal. But the abuser wants to win the argument. They're lacking the emotional intelligence to process somebody else's emotions, let alone their own emotions. So they just want to shut down the victim's emotions and dominate it. Another term is stonewalling. The victim brings up something and they just keep coming at them with different roadblocks to prevent the true essence of the conversation to be able to move on to a resolution. A survivor will notice that there's no resolution or solutions to these arguments. They might notice that all I needed was a 5-minute conversation and it turned into an hour and a half argument that I was so confused at the end, I forgot what point I brought up in the first place. It's that kind of mechanical dialogue where there are two individuals with entirely different belief systems about how relationships should function. One, like I said, wants a healthier connection. The other wants to dominate and win arguments. They see it as a contest more than an opportunity.
So, what is the impact of this emotional or psychological abuse?
A lot of these behaviors we can all do in a one-off situation when we get really defensive or something, and we don't even think about it. But when it's a pattern of behavior, it's characterological. And so if it was just lying, for example, and no other behaviors, the survivor could say, boy, this person keeps lying to me. I can't trust them. They can put two and two together. I can't trust this person I can't invest my life in somebody who is not trustworthy. This is too chaotic and dangerous. They can recognize that. But when multiple behaviors are at play, it becomes too confusing to be able to identify the patterns, because in one conversation, the abuser will use multiple behaviors. And the impact is that it just causes this high level of stress where the survivor is over functioning. They're trying so hard. Maybe if I say it this way, maybe if I say it that way, they'll understand me. They take on all this emotional work. So they're over functioning. They're doing the lion's share of the emotional lifting, while the offender puts hardly anything, any effort into the relationship. She's reading multiple books. He might read a chapter of a book. I don't mean to say he, because it can be she too. But so when you over function for so long in a state of confusion, you come to a place of just utter exhaustion. And all of these components create post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress, depending on if they lose their sense of identity. If that loss of identity is what will lead to complex post-traumatic stress, not simply being put down by somebody if they had a strong sense of identity, but oftentimes they don't. And so it leads to complex post-traumatic stress. So the impact is extreme. And in fact, in the hundreds of survivors that I've interviewed, they will say that even if they were physically assaulted on a regular basis, it was the emotional abuse that kept them so confused. And then when you combine that with the cycle of abuse, the tension building, the escalation and the conflict, and then the honeymoon phase, you have that intermittent positive reinforcement that's confusing them and strengthening that trauma bond. And so all of these things, all of these components make it very confusing and difficult for them to be able to even articulate what is going on in the relationship, which means they can't explain it in their own mind. So they're ruminating about these conversations over and over again, and they can't advocate for themselves. They can't explain it to someone that can understand it. Oftentimes when they explain it, it sounds petty, like they're complaining, because they aren't able to say, this is a pattern. One of the wonders about our terms and definitions is that now they have a language that everyone can understand. I'm being gaslit. I'm constantly being minimized. Withholding is another term. They withhold affection. I get the silent treatment as retaliation. They make promises they never keep, broken promises. I'm constantly entering a conversation calm and collected, and then the whole thing gets flipped around on me, blame shifting. When they can use these terms, they can paint a picture that another person can understand and see that this is really a toxic or abusive relationship.
So thank you for that. But now let's kind of switch abuse types here a little. And a big issue for many abuse victim survivors is something that you call double abuse. So you mentioned it earlier. So what is double abuse?
Well, double abuse is when the victim, who is highly stressed and fearful, finally finds the courage to speak out or reach out for help. And instead of being received with compassion and support, they experience things like criticism, or they're wrongly judged, or they receive incorrect instructions. When you think about it, before somebody in that state is going to reach out for help, they have thought about every way they can communicate with their abusive partner. They've tried this, they've tried 1,000 things, and nothing has worked. And so then when you sit across from someone and they start saying, well, you should do this, or well, have you tried that? And they start interrupting them and giving them wrong instructions, that they've already exhausted those things. They know down to the detail what they've tried and what hasn't worked. to then be dismissed or to be judged. I saying things like, I just can't see your partner being the way you're describing them. I don't know if I believe you. So now the survivor is basically abandoned in this conversation. What the survivor is looking for is to be able to process out loud with someone and just have the freedom to speak and have a really good listener. But instead, they get judged. Like what happened to me, I reached out. I was in a small group Bible study, and I reached out to the female leader of my Bible study, who was 10 years older than me and who taught marriage classes. So I thought she would have some knowledge. But what happened was I was not believed. I was judged for being too demanding and for disparaging my spouse. And her husband gave me ultimatums. If you don't go back into couples therapy within 90 days, we'll never allow you back in this group. And I'd been in this group for 14 years. So all of a sudden, I'm being imposed upon and wrongly judged. And couples therapy contraindicated. It's not advised when there any form of abuse is present. And I had figured that out. It wasn't working. It was only making matters work. And then to have people judge me. Now, what happens in this double abuse is that oftentimes now you really lose your identity because people who I thought loved me are suddenly opposing me and mischaracterizing me. And that affected how I fit into my social circle and my church. And so I felt like something must be intrinsically wrong with me if they aren't supporting me. I lost my sense of identity. I lost how I saw myself fitting into my broader community. And that loss of identity has a devastating effect. You not only feel abandoned and alone, but you're gossiped about, you're mischaracterized. It's an overwhelming negative experience to go through. And out of the hundreds of survivors that I interviewed, 97% of them wanted to talk about the double abuse. They were more traumatized by the double abuse than they were the original abuse. Now that became something they were hyper focused on and they couldn't understand and they were devastated by. It leads victims to a state of hopelessness and despair. If they're not going to help me, no one will.
So you've already given us one example of double abuse, but there are different types of double abuse that can happen. So can you give us a couple more examples?
Of course, yeah. It happens in therapy, in couples therapy a lot. And this is not against therapists. Most therapists are very well-meaning. They truly want to help. But if they haven't been educated, what ends up happening is the couple goes in to see a therapist. And if the therapist can't identify what's happening, they treat most couples as though it's a mutual responsibility problem. And so they start telling the survivor, well, when you say those things, it incites anger in your partner. So avoid those things. Or they just start instructing the survivor almost more than the abuser, because the abuser is the one that's creating the chaos, but they look to the survivor to be the one to stabilize it. So they give them instructions when they've already exhausted everything. So now they're not being fully aligned with, and they feel like they're being ganged up on and abandoned by the therapist. And the thing I want to say too is that a survivor, a victim survivor, whatever stage they're in, they have a reasonable expectation that when they go to a person of authority, that they're going to be met with compassion and support. And so the disparity between their expectation and what actually happens equates to the amount of trauma they're going to experience from that situation. So the victims will have a reasonable expectation, a high expectation in many cases, that a therapist is going to be able to see through what's happening. And then when they're not fully aligned with and supported, they're devastated. And so there's this big disparity, and that equates to a large amount of trauma that they experience from the encounter. So that's an example. I was closely aligned with a young child that age 14, and her male cousin had molested her. It wasn't rape, but it was molestation. And when she finally came out and spoke about it, her side of the family fully supported her and was affirming her for her courage to come forward. But the perpetrator's side of the family did the double abuse. They basically didn't believe her, and it created this rift in the family where it was basically one side of the family followed the narrative that the matriarch presented. And so the victim felt a loss of this family that was normally very close and celebrated all the holidays together and so forth. And that exacerbated her trauma from the molestation into something much larger. And it ended up dividing the family for more than 10 years until there was reparations made and apologies and things of that nature. But it was a devastating experience. And in fact, she ended up going to the emergency room like 10 times or more because her blood pressure kept dropping from the stress. Like when you have constant cortisol pumping through your system, your body gets erratic. It affects your hormones, it affects your immune system. The same thing happened to me when I was doubly abused. I was in the emergency room 13 times where my blood sugar and my blood pressure couldn't stabilize. And so I kept fainting. Also, my immune system was so compromised, I couldn't eat raw foods because of the slight amount of bacteria that was on them. I would go into this violent food poisoning. So it really affects your immune system. It's physical abuse in that way because of the impact that prolonged stress like that and extreme stress has on your physical well-being as well. But there's so many forms of double abuse because it can happen like if you go to a pastor and then the pastor says, well, God hates divorce and you need to suck it up. You need to submit. You need to this, you need to that, not seeing how detrimental it is. They're putting this priority on the institution of marriage rather than the well-being of the individuals inside that marriage, more than the well-being of the victim and children that are enduring this kind of ongoing abuse and stress. And so they feel completely abandoned by their faith community, and it has the same kind of effect.
So, when it comes to double abuse, this type of abuse, this form of abuse, where do you actually think this comes from? Because we're supposed to be going to places of support, and these people are not giving you support, whether it be a family member, whether it be a church pastor. We hear stories of police, firemen, therapists, and even DV shelters. Sometimes this can happen. So, especially with those other institutions, as we kind of go up the chain here, why does this happen when these are the people that should know what to do?
Well, you just answered your question because you said they should know what to do. But the problem is they're ignorant. They have very little knowledge. And so, we all have unconscious biases. It doesn't matter what neighborhood, what, microculture you're in, what ethnic culture, what traditions, we all have unconscious biases. And so where there's social conditioning, that they think victims are weak, uneducated, or they think they have such a lack of awareness about what domestic violence really is. They might think domestic violence is only physical violence. They might have zero idea about what emotional abuse is. There's also like a negative understanding about gender roles. So oftentimes this patriarchy is still in full effect. And I know that there's a lot of male victims too, so I don't want to undermine that, but I'm just using this as an example. There's an organization called International Justice Mission, and they go into third world countries where there's like systemic abuse. So like in India, it would be sex trafficking and indentured servitude. And what goes on in these societies all over the world is that law enforcement and the courts don't prosecute the crime is so normalized in society that they don't really prosecute it. They overlook it, they accept it. And so it's the lack of follow through on prosecuting that this double abuse that sustains the crimes and makes it more possible for them to happen. And this goes on all over the world. International Justice Mission goes in and they train their law enforcement, they train their court judges and court personnel, and they treat it as a comprehensive culture shift that needs to occur. So our cultures have all these toxic biases that I said, and we've heard victim blaming many times. And there is a lot of victim blaming. It's just ingrained. People are more comfortable criticizing a victim than they are criticizing a perpetrator. A perpetrator, they have to stand up tall and know what their argument is and confront them. It takes more of an investment. But to criticize somebody who's already downtrodden and weak is easy. It doesn't affect them. And so it's something that I think a lot of people do that are well-meaning. Sometimes it's intentional and it's not well-meaning, but it's easier. It's lazy.
So how can we help stop double abuse or intervene to prevent it from happening and just re-traumatizing survivors?
Such a great question. What the Mend Project does, it's about raising awareness and teaching people how to properly respond. So I think the more we talk, like your podcast is wonderful. You're talking, you're letting people's stories come into the public. You're legitimizing the severity of emotional abuse and domestic violence. It's such a taboo topic still where people don't really understand what it is. And there's just so much ignorance around it that I think we need to talk about it more, and we need to talk about ways to respond. We have a tool on our website called the Healing Model of Compassion. We have tools, visual tools for a lot of these things that I've talked about to help survivors and responders retain the information better for those visual learners. But it's basically tells you if you just listen, accept their story to be true, validate them, tell them nothing you did deserved this kind of maltreatment. Because abuse is a choice, it's not a mistake, and it's never the victim's fault. So you have to come from that stance. So you listen, you accept their story, you validate them, you don't interrogate them. You might ask them one question: how can I best support you? What can I do that you need the most right now? It might be a friend to talk to once a week for an hour, or something like that. But they just ask the question, what's the best way I can help you? So that they're not putting the victim in a position of having to explain themselves. They're giving them a safe place to communicate. And we need to talk more about how to respond to these things. Because I think a lot of people think that they need to fix it. Like how many times have you reached out to a friend? Maybe you were having a problem with your sibling or one of your parents, and you reached out to a friend and you confided in them. And rather than just listening to you, they start telling you, well, I wouldn't have said that if I were you, or well, you should do this instead of that. All of a sudden, your anxiety starts to increase and you're like, why did I even confide in this person? You're not getting the kind of listening that you need. But really, people think they have to fix it and give advice. And that's the last thing that survivors need. And I think we just need to talk more about that in public and make it more a common part of our vernacular instead of this taboo thing that people shy away from.
So before I jumped on this call with you today, I was actually writing out a debrief of someone's survivor story, and a big takeaway was the abuser's reactions to a provocation that had occurred, and keeping a survivor on the defensive was part of this. Shame comes up for the survivor. They start thinking, I'm the problem. That's part of the process. It creates doubt. There's a loss of trust in oneself. Some call it reactive abuse. I once defined it as reactive defense. Other people call it self-defense. Everyone has their opinion on this name, and people change it up all the time. I know you wanted to discuss this topic, and I know you wanted to address the myth of mutual abuse. So as our last question of the day, what would you say to this and the guilt and the shame that are created around mutual abuse?
What I'd like to say is that when victims are in a high state of stress, they have PTSD or CPTSD, they will tend to react. It's an involuntary trauma response. The reaction, involuntary response, will either be fight, flight, freeze, or appease, or if you want to say fawn. And so when it is a fight response, which is again involuntary, their body starts responding before their brain starts thinking. When they start attacking or yelling or throwing something or out of extreme frustration, they get labeled as the abuser. I like to call it reactive defense. Yes, there's all those feelings that you mentioned about self-doubt and a loss of identity and thinking that they're the problem. But I see that as a separate issue. I see that as they need to find their identity again. They need to get their agency back, which is a process of healing. But in terms of reactive defense, I think it's that they get blamed. Let's say they're in this argument where the perpetrator is doing all these covert things, and then they say, "You're such a jerk." Now suddenly the focus is on, "You called me a jerk." And that is where all the energy shifts, the focus shifts. So you're abusive. And so the victim starts wondering, am I abusive? Because of all the self-doubt that they're experiencing. And they wonder truly if they are. But what I love is that I was so happy to see that the National Domestic Violence Hotline came out with a statement about mutual abuse. And they said mutual abuse does not exist. And the reason is because the mindset of an abuser is to dominate and to control, to power over, to downgrade their partner. But the mindset of the victim who might react in an abusive way is very different. They don't want to control or empower. They're wanting safety. They're wanting equality. They're wanting the craziness to stop. It's an involuntary trauma response. It's not a premeditated need to win the argument or to dominate over the other person. And that's why there's that distinction. So thank you for asking that question.
So before we go today, you are part of the MEND project. That is the MEND, and MEND is spelled MEND, project, project.com. You can go there right now if you would like to. But Annette, can you just give us a really good overview of some of the things that the website is offering?
Thank you for asking that. The MEND project, it started out as a comprehensive website so that you could go to one place and get all this information and more relating to different aspects of abuse. So we have over 100 blog posts. An article, one of our most popular articles, is on reactive defense. But we also talk about couples therapy, double abuse, you name it, we've talked about it. It's in our blogs. We also offer once a month on YouTube, we do a free webinar and we go deeper into topics surrounding abuse. We have a course that I highly recommend to any of your listeners who feel confused or insecure or they're doubting themselves. This course was beta tested with a lot of survivors, domestic violence agencies, first responders, therapists. It was tested over basically a 4-year period. And our language is so precise, it will directly resonate with survivors. So it's just 4 modules, but it will jumpstart their healing. A common remark we get from graduates is, "This saved me a year of therapy." And it's a very inexpensive course. And if you can't afford it, we offer free scholarships. We're a nonprofit, so we try to really meet victims where they are. And we also have a coaching call twice a month. and it's very inexpensive, and you can ask any question you want, and nothing's off limits. It's a very safe community. Yeah, that's basically what we offer, is tools and resources for people to help themselves.
For those of you out there who are wanting to learn more, or for those of you who want to take a course or receive the free tools and resources that the mendproject.com offers, for first responders who are working alongside survivors who want to know more about doing things in a healing way and interacting with survivors in a healing way and not in a harmful way going forward, please go to the mendproject.com. And I really can't thank you enough, Annette Oltmans, for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Take good care.
So once again, thank you, Annette Oltmans, for being here. And for those of you who want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. Click on the guest form button, fill out the form, and we'll go from there. We also have a support group at our website, and you can reach our support group at narcissistapocalypse.com, where we have Zoom meetings every Wednesday nights, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. We also have forum boards for you to post on to get the validation you need from survivors just like you. And we have a free newsletter at our website where you get a free workbook for every new survivor story that comes out, all at narcissistapocalypse.com. And that is it for today's episode. So for myself and Annette Oltmans, we hope you have a good night.